If you're a committed Herle Burly, you know how much I love my rural roots in Prelate, Saskatchewan. The fact is, though, that my parents had to move from Prelate when I was 5 years old so that my brother and sister and I would have access to the things we needed to succeed in life: good schools, jobs, and medical care. It's one reason I feel as strongly as I do that the people of rural Canada need to be better connected. Our presenting sponsor, TELUS, has been working on digitally connecting rural and remote Canadians for years now. It's no exaggeration to say it's a community-by-community effort. Take the story of Gold River, British Columbia, population 1,500. The nearest hospital is 89 kilometers away. Without the ability to use a cell phone for emergency medical care, health and safety was a real issue. So was connecting to teachers and education when public health measures closed schools during the pandemic. A new cell tower lit up in Gold River early in 2020, connecting the town to TELUS's world-leading 4G LTE network. Along with cell service, the tower gave residents reliable and fast internet service. Gold River was a critical milestone for TELUS. It was the last BC town with a population over 1,000 to connect to their network. You can learn more about what TELUS is doing to bridge digital divides at connectingcanadaforgood.ca. But the fact is, a country as vast as Canada means there's a hell of a lot more work to do to connect our rural and remote communities. TELUS knows this and will continue to bridge regional digital divides so that all Canadians are connected to the technology and resources needed to maximize opportunity, especially in the small places we call home. Today we have a two-part pod. Part one is Jennifer Welsh. I'm proud to call Jennifer my friend. Unlike many of the people that come on here as mercenaries to hawk a book, Jennifer is actually a friend of mine. Her CV is longer than my COVID hair, so I will abbreviate it for you just a bit. Like me, she hails from Regina. Like me, she went to St. Matthew's Elementary School. Like me, she went to Dr. Martin Laboldus High School. Then things start to diverge just a little bit. Unlike me, she is a Rhodes Scholar, earning her Masters and Doctorate in International Relations from the University of Oxford. She's currently the Canada 150 Research Chair in Global Governance and Security and serves as the Director of the Centre for International Peace and Security Studies at McGill University. We're going to talk about Canada's place in the world and the world generally. Get that, people listening? We're going to be talking about the world. Part two is our consistently entertaining, always gorgeous political panel. We've got Jenni Byrne coming to us by way of Jenni Byrne and Associates, by way of Doug Ford's office, by way of Stephen Harper's inner circle, by way of the Reform Party of Canada, by way of the Fenelon Falls IGA. Next to Jenni in his hazy yellow Zoom square is Scott Reid, principal at Feschuk-Reid Communications, former director of communications to Paul Martin, senior advisor to many federal and provincial Liberal leaders, noted media commentator here on the planet Earth, as well as all across the multiverse. We're going to talk about a bunch of things today. We're going to talk about corporate welfare and electric vehicles. We're going to dump on Trump. We're going to talk about misogyny, racism, and Dean Martin roasts out in British Columbia. And we may get to some other things along the way. Anyway, Jennifer Welsh, you're here with me auspiciously today from Regina, Saskatchewan. How are you?
I'm good. It's very nice to be with you, and it's nice to be in Regina. And it's beautiful here. It's autumn as it should be.
It's the one day of autumn when the leaves turn and fall from the tree.
Yeah, it's windy though. Surprise, surprise. Wind, wind, wind always.
Yeah.
Does your head in.
Always. Now, is Regina open? Are you able to get out and about to your normal haunts?
Yes. Well, it's semi-open. It's much more open than Montreal, where I came from. So there's a lot of mask wearing here, which is good. I think people have really bought into what they need to do. But more restaurants are open. But it's interesting. So you know Wascana Park that snakes around there's a path that snakes around the legislature. And I've been out walking there. and they've got arrows painted on the path to take you in the right direction. You can't just walk aimlessly as we used to. There's now a direction you have to go around Wascata Park. So that was kind of weird, okay. But people do it. So it's interesting, yeah. The airport was dead when I landed. Absolutely dead. I mean, talk about an airport.
How did you feel about flying? How did you feel about flying?
I didn't feel great about it. It was the first time I'd been on an airplane since February 28th. I remember the last flight I took was to New York. So it was a strange feeling. I really wanted to be COVID free, given I'm coming out here for personal reasons to see a sick relative. So I was a little bit paranoid, but it was actually fine. You know, people on airplanes are being very careful, and it's just not pleasant like it used to be.
Was the middle seat full?
No, but that could have been, because it wasn't a very full flight. I had one person next to me. So, and it wasn't full. But Toronto Airport.
I don't know that I'm going to get on a plane till there's a vaccine, Jennifer.
Yeah, I wouldn't have done it, but I needed to do it. So, and I think, interesting to me, Toronto Airport was busier than I expected. Regina Airport was absolutely dead. They're now down to, I think, 3 to 4 flights a day maximum. WestJet has, no longer has a base in Regina. The airport is just a ghost town. Sad. It's really sad.
Really? Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Well, let's talk about you for a little bit.
Yeah.
Just before we get going, I want to talk about you for just a little bit. You have taught at Oxford. You've taught at other prestigious universities in Europe. At one point when I talked to you, you were in Italy, in Florence.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
You're back in Canada. And what is your current gig at McGill, and what brought you back to Canada?
So the answer to that kind of comes together. So in 2017, when it was the 150th anniversary of Canada, the Canadian government, I guess it's the Department of, I'm not going to get the name right here, Science, Research and Innovation, Kirsty Duncan's portfolio.
I got it. Yeah.
It created a special category of Canada Research Chairs just for the 150th anniversary. So there's been a Canada Research Chair program now for a number of years, which is designed to create academic positions and also a bit of a bring Canadians back to Canada with these research chairs. And so they set one up for the 150th.
Yeah, that was a Chrétien government initiative, I think.
That's right. Yeah. And I have to say, they've been amazing, right? Because they are targeted very much at people who are Canadians but who are outside the country, or as a real retention mechanism for really talented Canadian academics. And so I heard about a Canada 150. You could not apply yourself as an individual. A university had to apply on your behalf. And I had been starting to think about coming back to Canada. But I can honestly say I don't know that I would have jumped so quickly had it not been for this scheme. It came at the right time and was the right position to give me enough research time. So I do teach, but I teach less than I would if I were a full professor with a standard contract. So I have more time for research, hence the name Research Chair. But it's interesting, most of these have gone to people in the hard sciences. I'm one of the very few Canada 150s that went to the social sciences. I think there was one psychologist and one person in education and me, and a lot of them go to, I know of astronomers, physicists who have come back. But it's been a great scheme to bring people back. So that's where I am. And when McGill offered to apply on my behalf for the chair, They also asked me if I would take up the directorship of a center that they have at McGill called the Center for International Peace and Security Studies, which is a really good fit for me. And I've, come to the view that there's a lot of potential in the city of Montreal to grow a center like that, given the bilingualism, given the ties to other parts of the world, close to Ottawa, but not in Ottawa. And so I've got some plans for what I'd like to do with the center. So that's my gig.
Very interesting. So, and you had some pretty sweet gigs over there. Let's just pretend that you're living in Florence, Italy.
Yeah.
Right. What prompts you to want to come back to Canada? The winters in Montreal suck hard.
I actually don't mind them because you get a lot of
snow. Oh my God, they're bad. We're from Regina. I think they're bad winters.
Wow, you do, hey?
There's a lot of snow.
I've only experienced 2 of them, so I think I need to have a few more before what I like is the volume of snow.
Well, I was there before climate change, so.
Yeah, so that could be it. That could be it. My position, so I was at a university in Florence that was set up by the European Union in the late 70s to train doctoral students from all the EU member states. So the language of instruction is English. And of course, in the early 90s, it expanded to include the countries of Eastern Europe who joined the EU. And the contracts at the EUI are purposely not permanent. So you can't have tenure there because they want blood to circulate. They want people to come from different countries, be there for a bit, go back to their old universities. So I had a leave of absence from Oxford where I had my permanent job. And I went to the EUI for 5 years. So I always knew, as much as we were enjoying it, that we weren't going to be in Italy forever. Sad as that was, it was a really great experience for my family, for my children, who, we were just talking the other day. My daughter is now taking, more advanced history lessons. And I said to her, remember, we did go to St. Peter's for your 10th birthday. We went to St. Peter's Basilica. You got to see it. So it's, the penny drops occasionally of the things they've gotten to see. But the real decision was whether to go back to the UK. And I have to say, Brexit was really a factor for me. So all along the time that I was thinking about whether to go back, take the Canada Research Chair, the fallout from Brexit was becoming clear. And, you get to a point in your life where you figure out what are the things you really want to be fighting for. And I just saw, as David Miliband, once called Brexit the greatest act of political disarmament, just such a shot in the foot. And I could see the union of the United Kingdom potentially unraveling, Scotland potentially becoming independent. Who knew what would happen with Northern Ireland? A really rough couple of decades. And I just said, this is not my fight. This is not what I'm interested in. And I also began to worry about what it would mean for my kids' opportunities as we go forward. Already the UK is a wonderful place to live, but it's a very competitive place. It's a very expensive place. It's a very competitive place. And now you think about a serious downturn in the economy and uncertainty. And I thought, maybe we just don't want to be part of that. And actually, I think a lot of academics left the UK, particularly those, a lot of continental Europeans left. I'm not saying for a moment that they still don't have fantastic talent, but I think, the ripple effects of Brexit are wide. And we've since just watched it go on and on. I mean, this was 2016, and the uncertainty continues 4 years, and it's still rife with uncertainty. Incredible. So that was what made the decision to come to Canada instead.
Why do you say England is a competitive place?
there are, I think it's in the DNA. It has a lot to do with the private school system. It has a lot to do with the way that your opportunities are defined at a very young age. I feel like in the United Kingdom, you kind of can't make a mistake with your career choice because there will be no turning back. You know, the education system, the A-level system, you specialize at a very young age, you get in a track, and it's very, very hard to get out of it. The property market is incredibly expensive. So, you know, the thought, I have nephews that live in the UK, my husband's British, you know, the difficulty that they have had, both my nephews have very good jobs. To even begin to enter the property market is so difficult. It is just a more competitive place in terms of making your way in the world. Now, I know we have some of this in Canada. Canada is not a perfect place. But I've always felt that, you know, one of the things that Canada has, and it certainly has had, is an incredible degree of social mobility. Right? You know, you and I are an example of this. You know, I'm first generation to go to university, to finish high school, and right. Look at, you know, I'm one of 6 kids. Look at all the different things that we have been able to do. That is very difficult to do in the UK, unless you are extremely wealthy. So, you know, those are the things that began to weigh on me.
Right. I get that. Hey, I don't know if your ears were burning last week, but in your seat last week was John Stackhouse.
Oh, yes.
And your name came up in our conversation because we were talking about his book.
Yeah, Canadian Diaspora.
Canada. Yeah. And so you were one of the people that we were talking about in that. And I just ask you the same question I asked him. What do you think is the potential? So we've got all this talent that has gone to find its apex wherever it can find it. What is the potential for that group of people to help Canada? I wish I could be more clear. And you mention it. We'll get to your report. We'll get to your report in just a second, but you reference it in your report that this is a resource to be harnessed. So how would we harness it?
Yeah, it's a really, really interesting question because I think we have thought very narrowly in Canada about what diaspora are, right? We've celebrated diaspora from other parts of the world who live in this country, and mostly it's seen as a very positive thing. It's seen as very compatible with our national identity as multicultural. Sometimes we worry about diaspora with respect to what it means for translating into foreign policy, you know, that you have particular diaspora agenda that can be in tension with the Canadian national interest in a particular issue area. But we don't think about the Canadian diaspora, whether they are outside of Canada or those who are coming back. And, you know, some interesting things have been done. Around 2007, I wrote a short piece on this for the Literary Review of Canada because that was just after the war with Lebanon when, you know, the Canadian government discovered that there were, 30,000 Canadian citizens living in Lebanon who suddenly were like, help us get home. There's a war here.
Yeah.
And there was this kind of explosion of commentary in the Canadian newspapers and journals about the diaspora and how we deal with the Canadians abroad. But I do think there is potential to harness that group of people. Certainly those who are still abroad, to think about, you know, how they can play a role in an advisory sense. But even, you know, there are some countries that experiment with seats in parliament for diaspora. I think it's something we should be a lot more creative about. And then when you think about John's interest of people returning, how is it that in the first years that we return to Canada, how is it that we tap into the experiences that people have had before they become, as all people who are senior in their job become completely enmeshed in the pressures of their new workplace. So I have another great member of the Canadian diaspora with me at McGill, who was a Canada 150, who's now Tim Evans, who spent many years outside of Canada, is a global public health scholar and practitioner. I know he's been very involved in thinking about Quebec and Canada's COVID response, but someone like that, I do think there is potential for us to think about more systematically how we draw on their experiences.
Right. So let's go to your book then, because it sort of takes me mentally right there, because I'm not an optimist by nature. And so, I read John's book, and I felt John's book said, Canada's over. Canada doesn't matter anymore. Canada and the world is over. It doesn't matter anymore. But we have these people around the world in positions that do matter. And maybe they can help us navigate our way through this world. And so
and it's true that, it's true that just on that point, that one of the things I think we don't pay attention to, and I had forgot, so thanks for reminding me, I'd forgotten about this in John's book, the Canadians who work in international organizations. And there are more of them than we realize. And I think that is a resource that we need to think about much more. So I had a position when I was outside of Canada still. I was living in Italy. I was working as an advisor to the UN Secretary General. And I remember someone from the Canadian mission contacting me and saying, there's a lot of discussion around how you got this post, and, did the government help you and all the rest of it? And I said, no, the government wasn't involved at all. I don't even think the government knew I was going to be appointed. And then after that, discussion was over, I thought, but maybe they should have known. Maybe we should have had a stronger connection the whole time that I played that role, but we didn't. And I think that was a missed opportunity.
It's a very good example.
Yeah.
Very good example. So you've recently co-authored and released a provocative think piece calling for a new concept of Canada's place in the world and a foreign policy that reflects it. It's called Reframing Canada's Global Engagement, 10 Strategic Choices for Decision Makers. I love that format, by the way, very easy to comprehend and digest. Let me start with this, Jennifer. You were involved in the last major Canadian federal government foreign policy review 15 years ago. And you might be in a particular position to tell us, why is it so difficult for Canada to develop a coherent strategic foreign policy framework?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think about it a lot in relative terms. There was a lot of discussion around our lost Security Council bid in terms of who our competitors were, Ireland and Norway. And when I think of those two countries, they are actually incredibly strategic about their foreign policy. Particularly Ireland. If you think about Ireland in the last 5 years, it's been very, very active, obviously, in making sure it gets a seat on the Security Council, but it's been very strategic about Brexit. It made sure there was no way the European Union was going to throw it under a bus in order to reach a deal with the UK. And the greatest talent in the Irish government was marshaled to know more about Brexit and its impact than those in London knew. Very strategic. And Norway too. I mean, Norway has a particular identity, I think, in two domains that it's put a lot of resources behind and a lot of expertise developed. One is in mediation and what we call in the business track 2 negotiations as well. Track 2 is when you have mediation not at the official level of conflict parties or governments, but you try to mediate not through the United Nations process, but through a lower level that's less seen, that's less visible. But they also do a lot of work in mediation. And the other area they're very involved in is in refugees and migration. The Norwegian Refugee Council is an incredible organization that works all around the world, particularly in the Middle East. And so you ask yourself, what is it that prevents Canada from having that kind of laser sharp focus? And I think there's two things, right? One is, and this is going to sound strange, we're too big, right? So we never think of ourselves as being too big. But in this domain, we are. I mean, Ireland and Norway are not large countries. They are not members of the G7. Canada, even though it's always thought of itself as a middle power, which it is also part of some very large and important organizations. And as a result of that, we are spread very thin, and we have to have, think of a full service B&B, right? A full service B&B has everything. It has the English breakfast. It has the, Egyptian cotton sheets. It has everything. We have this full service foreign policy because we play in all of these domains, but we are spread very thin. And we are, it's not my phrase. I wish I could remember the coiner of that. We are a serial joiner, right? We are members of so many organizations, also partly because of the bilingualism. So it's the Francophonie and the Commonwealth. So that is one of the issues. That means that we have to be engaged at all of these levels, but yet we're not big enough, like the United States or Germany, for example, that we can allocate the kind of resources to be really strategic about how we operate in all those forums. And I think the other reason is that we are not strategic is that we have a very strange regional identity. We don't actually have one, right? So if you think about Norway and Ireland, they very much belong to a region. Canada doesn't. We belong to several regions. And in fact, one of the things, you go back to the 2005 Foreign Policy Review, one of the things I was very exercised about and tried to push through that review was that Canada take very seriously its membership in the region of North America. And my North America includes Mexico, right? So that Canada needed to do a lot more to engage, understand Mexico, see Mexico as a gateway also to the Americas, to the South. But, we're a Pacific country, we're an Americas country, we're a transatlantic country. We don't have a strong regional identity. And I think that also hurts our capacity to be strategic. Those are the two main reasons. I think the other ailment that has, and I say this with some trepidation, we've just been incredibly lucky for 50, 60 years, right? We have not faced an existential threat. We have had as our neighbor, until relatively recently, a fairly predictable country that actually assists in a huge way with our security. We've been on the side of those countries that have had the most weight in international institutions, and it's made us a little bit lazy. We've been incredibly fortunate, and now all of that is crumbling. We cannot take any of that for granted. And so it requires us to be very clear-eyed about what's going on. But those are, I think others would have other reasons that have to do more with the way our government is structured in different government departments. But those would be the reasons I would give you.
Right. So to me, this is all incredibly depressing, Jennifer, because, I know that everybody likes to hate on the United States. And certainly in the age of Trump, everybody loves to hate on the United States. But, hating on the U.S. has been a Canadian hobby for a long time. But we have, as you said, been beside the global superpower that didn't try to take us over. It protected us, and it gave us complete access to its markets and gave us cover in the world and put us on things like the G7. I mean, the decline of America is a horrible development for Canada.
Yeah.
In my view, a horrible development for Canada. And let's start with, does it have to happen?
The U.S.'s relative decline?
Yeah.
To a certain extent, I think it does, right? And you're absolutely right that I think Canadians have had, schadenfreude for too long. Like there's this kind of, wow, you sort of rub your hands together that they're having a hard time down there. And we really have to grow up about that because it's serious. I mean, I remember again, around the time of the last foreign policy review, if you remember, this was post 9/11, and the United States was obsessed with counterterrorism and making sure that Canada was not a threat to its security, right? Mainly through, surely the hijackers, crossed the border from Canada. Well, of course they didn't, right? But we had to prove that we were safer than safe. We were the potential security threat. You look in 2020, we're faced with a remarkable situation where actually, even though in terms of a security umbrella, of course, we still have NORAD and and U.S. nuclear deterrent, but there's a huge number of threats to our security that come from the United States, including political instability, which I really hope that officials in Ottawa are planning for. Not because I want it to happen or I think 100% it will happen, but we have to scenario plan for that possibility because it would be irresponsible not to, right? It's right. That bad, right? Never mind people coming up with COVID, but also migration, all kinds of things. So in terms of your question about does all of this have to happen, I think you have one trend that is inevitable, and that is the U.S.'s relative decline. And I think the word relative is really important, right? Relative decline vis-a-vis other rising powers, the most important of which is China. But there will be, over the next 2 decades, others. I would have said 8 months ago, India in that category, although I think India now is one of the countries that is being most negatively impacted by COVID in really quite tragic ways. But that relative decline is inevitable when you look at where economic trends are going, population trends are going, even with the center of gravity, and that we're seeing so much more South-South interaction. So economic and political exchange happening within the South. It is where the majority of the world's population lives. Now, the U.S. remains the most important military power, and it remains, a hugely dynamic country, no matter what we might be seeing at the moment. But its relative decline is inevitable. And power transitions, we know from history, and I mean way back, let's go back a century or more, they're always prone to instability. But we need to remember that, it isn't inevitable that you're going to have some sort of military showdown with China. But we do have to see as likely instability coming with power transition. Now, were other aspects of U.S. decline inevitable? Since I would argue around 2011, 2012, under the Obama administration, the U.S. also started to, and some would say it was happening before as well, to a certain extent it was retreating from its position of global leadership willingly. So this isn't necessarily about how power is being redistributed. It was stepping back from being the world's policeman, from trying to shape international institutions. That's been happening for some time. It has been placed on turbocharge by the Trump administration, right? So their disinvestment But beyond disinvestment, outright hostility to some of those institutions has been remarkable. That is not inevitable, right? You could have had a different trajectory. You could have had a managed withdrawal that would have seen the U.S. very cleverly continue to try to shape institutions. It would have had to give in to demands for reform in different ways. But it's an interesting counterfactual to ask, what would have happened had there been different U.S. leaders. How much of it can Joe Biden, if he's elected, restart? Some of it, but not all of it. Some of it. And I do also think from an economic point of view...
I have low expectations for Joe, by the way.
Yeah. And I also think from an economic point of view, he's not necessarily great news. He's very much about Buy America. I'm not sure. He may not be slapping, punishing tariffs on China, but I think he is going to be quite protectionist. So, but, some of the things we've seen, I'll just give you one example of something that is just so incredible in my mind, right?
Free trade's out of fashion, by the way.
Yeah, exactly. It was Trump about 3 weeks ago gave a press conference about the World Trade Organization. He said, the World Trade Organization was effectively created to rip off the United States. We've given so much. And I just sat there and thought, how can a U.S. president say that? Since 1945, the WTO and the GATT made the United States rich. It was because, so to have him say that just shows you where we are. That is the mentality in a portion of the political class in the U.S.
Okay. Well, let's take the United States for a second and put it to the side. And let's talk about China. So a month or so ago, I had Ambassador David Mulroney on this program.
Yep.
Are you familiar with his point of view?
I think so.
Right.
Yes, I'm relatively familiar where he comes down on these things. Yes.
Well, his point of view is that China represents a real threat, that they have serious ambitions for the globe, and that Canada is not a serious participant in dealing with that, and that we have an outmoded, naive, if not worse, policy toward China. So, and in the course of getting ready for that interview, I talked to a lot of people about the issue, all of whom thought that at a minimum, the term of Xi has changed their perspectives about what was possible in terms of engagement with China. Where are you currently at in what China represents to Canada?
Yeah, I mean, this is the question of our time, right? I think that China represents still a country with which there has to be smart forms of engagement, but not engagement of the kind that we were practicing for 2 decades. Engagement that was premised on the notion that through engagement comes change from within. The strange reality we find ourselves in, and there's very little historical parallel for it, is that it is both a threat to some of our most important values and interests, but it's also a necessary partner on certain issues, on climate change negotiations, on peace and security issues. China needs to be at the table, and Canada needs to be finding ways to cooperate with it. But I agree that the last 5 years of Chinese leadership have been really troubling, and they've been troubling in kind of 3 respects, right? One has been internally, with respect to increased repression, reversal of liberalization, the Uyghur population, And, there's an old debate about this, with which you're well aware, going back to Jean Chrétien's Team Canada visits, right? Do you turn a blind eye to that? You don't. You speak out when and how you can. And if you actually look at the number of countries that are saying anything about the Uyghurs at the moment and their concerns about them, there are precious few. And it's important, and I think Canadians who are critical are wrong to say it's just words. I think we have to do it, but we are going to be punished for it. So that's the first reason. The second reason is, of course, China's becoming more aggressive in its region. And there, David Mulroney's perspective about whether it has global ambitions, it's not clear to me what its global ambitions are, but it's very clear to me that it has hegemonic ambitions for Asia and for Africa, and that it will, when it can, be a hugely disruptive influence in liberal democracies, whether that's through cyber attacks. But in terms of wanting to run the world in the kind of, science fiction types, like to be the global hegemon, it's not clear to me that that's actually what China's strategy is. So that's the second way. It is becoming much more aggressive in its region, including, not accepting rulings from the International Court of Justice about territorial issues, including with India. Very, very worrying. And then thirdly, and this is something that I think is less seen, is it's become much more assertive within organizations like the United Nations, where it gives more money, where it now has some of the most senior positions, and where it is actually pushing a particular substantive agenda that is troubling to some of the goals that Canada has pursued. And that is a much more quiet form of Chinese action, but to me, it is just as worrying because it's been very successful from what I've seen in doing that. And so it is, compared to 5 years ago, 6 years ago, we're facing a very different landscape. And there's no question that we have to engage very, very tactically. And we are also going to be punished. And we've seen a number of liberal democracies be punished, and we have to stand together. And we have to work more together and support one another to the degree that we can.
Surely the United States can still play the role of convener of all the great nations in the world. So when I look at China,
to an extent, it can. To an extent, it can.
Okay.
Lost some of that too, but to an extent, it can. Yes.
So in the theory of when all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. To me, Jennifer, everything looks like a campaign. So why doesn't the United States and Europe create a grand alliance with South America and India to counterbalance what China is doing in Asia and Africa? Like, the United States is going to be smaller than China, but the Western bloc doesn't have to be weaker than the Asian bloc, does it?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a little bit more messy than that, in the sense that we have to be very careful that we are not isolating key players in Asia. I think a huge part of Canada's immediate strategy is working very closely with countries like South Korea and Japan. Because what's interesting there is China's assertiveness, what some have called its wolf diplomacy, it's experiencing some resistance to it, right? There are other countries in Asia too that are not happy, being pushed around through very blunt coercion. And what we don't want to do is create a form of alliance that also kind of creates some geographic blocks And a country like Vietnam as well, that has always had a very complicated relationship with China, but is again a country that, you know, we've had historically, particularly during the government of Pierre Trudeau, some very interesting links were formed with Vietnam in a development sense. And again, we have, you know, some advantages of language. So I think part of what we need to be doing is engaging carefully with India. India seems like the silver bullet, right? It's a democracy. It should be where we're placing our bets. It's complicated. I agree with that. It is so wrapped up with its domestic issues, which are enormous. The scale of India's domestic issues are truly breathtaking, especially after COVID. So I think there's a limit. I talked to one of our former diplomats in the course of working on this report, and he sort of poured some cold water on my enthusiasm for how far we can get with India in the current climate. But we have to try. And I, like many other observers right now, believe it's also important for democracies to stand together. And that's not always a very popular view, right? You have some in Canada who are saying, well, it's becoming a world where, you know, it's great powers. We can't really care who we do business with. If they're autocratic, who cares? Like, you got to get things done. True, we have to engage with countries of all kinds. But I do think that we need to be working together as liberal democracies. And by that, I mean South Korea and Japan. I mean, look at countries who have done relatively well in the pandemic. They are very important liberal democracies. And I would like to see our relationships with those two countries also develop over time in the medium term.
Do governments have the autonomy, the actual autonomy, to construct a foreign policy based on national interest and the strategy you're talking about? Or are they inevitably too dominated by business and commercial interests?
Well, it's interesting that you see the national interest and the business interest as being contrary. I mean, sometimes they work together. In the case
of China, I know that there are significant economic interests in Canada, that have a big interest in us engaging with China.
Yeah.
And they've been historically politically influential, those economic interests.
Yeah. I think there is still enough autonomy. I think it's difficult, but I think there is still enough autonomy. I mean, you're seeing it in the United States,
right,
where, you know, there are huge concerns in parts of the U.S. business community about what is increasingly a bipartisan consensus, not just that China has to be managed, but that China has to be actively weakened, because if it does better, ergo, that means the U.S. does worse. That's the attitude I don't want to see Canada take. I don't want us to take the attitude that we don't want China to prosper in any way, that it's a zero-sum game. I don't think that that's the way forward. But there is, you know, increasing consensus in the U.S., and the business community there is very worried about it. And I think in a sense, it's an experiment for the question you've asked me, right? Will they, you know, how much will they claw back some of these restrictions? But at least that government is showing that it has a certain degree of autonomy. And I think ours still has a degree of autonomy. It's hard, but I think it's possible. I may be naive in saying that, but I think I've never believed that there's just a straight, in every instance, that there's a straight economic driver.
Right. Okay. You make the case in this 10 questions document that Canada, which has always relied on multilateral institutions to advance its interests globally, will rely on that even more going forward when we don't have the U.S. to fight our battles in the same way for us. And yet you make note of how weak multilateral institutions are right now. What hope do you have that we could, I'm a big Star Trek fan, and at some point there's a world government and we all wear the same uniform. What is your hope for a functioning Security Council at the United Nations?
My hope is not particularly strong in the short term for that. With respect to multilateralism, I think we have to break this down, right? And I think this is what's difficult about the debate in Canada at the moment. Multilateralism is discussed as if it's kind of one thing, and also as if it's an end rather than a means. I mean, multilateralism is ultimately about a way of achieving your goals. You have to figure out what your goals are and what's the right institution to pursue them through. And I do think some of our multilateral institutions are really struggling. I think the UN Security Council is deadlocked in a tragic way, to be completely honest. And I don't see in the immediate term how we get around that. I do think if it gets a little bit worse, it has to get a little bit worse. There may be serious discussions about alternatives or about changes to it, because over time, if this continues, it will simply be marginalized. And there are a couple of countries who really don't want that to happen, whose power rests on them being Security Council members, France being one of them, and Russia being one of them. So, but in the short term, I don't hold out much hope. Now, the UN is bigger than the Security Council, and there are parts of the UN system which are working reasonably well. But I think we have to look at different forms of multilateralism, and we have to pick our spots. So we have to look at particular regional organizations. We also have to look at those that we're not members of, but where there are discussions that really affect our interests. So, for example, China is an observer at the Arctic Council, right? It's not a member of the Arctic Council, but obviously has keen interest in what goes on there. The same may be said for Canada with the Shanghai Cooperation Council or other bodies. But I think multilateralism should and can be developed in new forms. For example, we talk a little bit in this report and in the background document about the need for new multilateral mechanisms for the digital world, for AI, but also for dealing with intellectual property, for setting standards. There will be, I'm optimistic, new cooperative forums around international finance. Still, we had a financial stability board, the next version of that. I think there's an interesting question about how the G20 needs to function. It has not performed well during the pandemic. It too has been infected with the U.S.
Why not? I was going to ask you that. I'm so proud of it because Paul Martin kind of invented it. But why hasn't it taken off?
It's the U.S.-China rivalry is paralyzing it. Not to the same degree as the Security Council, but a lot of the competitive dynamics have spilled over into the G20. But I am more hopeful. I mean, in that context, they have been able to agree to some debt relief. I am more hopeful that body will be a mechanism going forward. But for example, the WHO is another one that's discussed a lot. And whether it is capable of reform, whether we should even think about reform, or whether we should try to develop a new global health form, a new cooperative mechanism. There's now something called COVAX, which is a cooperative initiative to try to develop an equitable vaccine outside of the WHO framework. One institution that we do need to invest in is the WTO. Because it's key to giving us continued open trade that is going to fuel some of this prosperity. So that is a multilateral organization that's struggling right now, but that we can't give up on. And hopefully a new U.S. administration would scale back some of its destructive tendencies with respect to the WTO.
I only have time for one last question for you, Jennifer. This hour has flown by.
Yeah.
Flown by.
We'll do it again.
Yeah. That would be so amazing if you would agree to do it again. My question is about COVID, and your vantage point and your studies probably have given you a unique perch from which to opine on how different countries, Canada, the United States, UK, Europe, dealt with COVID on the basis of their cultures and political systems and et cetera. Is that it all seems to have been quite different.
It is super fascinating. And I think it's a great time for behavioral psychologists and scholars of political culture, because they have mattered so much. I mean, look at Sweden. You know, the emblem of the good international citizen went their own way and did it very bravely. And the jury's still out, right? I mean, the jury is still out. But you are absolutely right that one thing that there were a lot of people who spoke too soon about COVID, you know, what its effects were going to be. And one of those presumptuous judgments was that autocratic systems were going to do better than democratic systems. That has not proven to be the case. Some democracies have done relatively well. Others have not. Some autocracies have done relatively well. Others have not. So it's not your political system. It's your political culture. And, you know, there was a really interesting exchange between Boris Johnson, the UK Prime Minister, and the President of Italy a few weeks ago. I'll try to send you the link. And Boris Johnson said, you know, it's amazing, Mr. President, how Italians are wearing masks and following social distancing. And he said, you know, British people just love their freedom too much to do that. And the Italian president turned to him and said, Italians love their freedom too. And I've lived in Italy, David. I can tell you, Italians love their freedom. They park wherever the heck they want, on the curb, right? They are so anarchic, right? It's not about loving freedom or not. He said they love their freedom, but they know when they have to take serious steps for the common good. And it's true. And there is and I think it was also, Italy had such a traumatic experience, right? They were the first. What happened in Italian hospitals was literally traumatic. And it was traumatic for the country. And I think that has been although I note very sadly in the last week, things are getting worse in Italy again, but they were very good. I mean, France is an absolute disaster, right? It's a disaster, the number of cases. So it is extremely interesting to watch. I think some populist leaders have also shaped the nature of the response in Brazil, in India. And I think the counterfactual, you know, if they had not been leading, would it have played out differently? I suspect it would have. But yeah, even though this is a medical, or what does the WHO call it? A disease event. The most interesting stuff that's going to be written is by political scientists and psychologists about why we all behaved the way we did, right? And trust. If you trust your government, and Canadians do by and large, for whatever reason.
Yeah, after all said and done, after all the bitching and complaining, they did what they were told. We all did what we were told.
We did what we were told. So there you go.
Jennifer, good luck out there in Regina.
Yeah,
I'm happy you're there. I'm sorry you have to be there. But
yeah,
thank you for squeezing in an hour.
I'll get back to Montreal.
And if you would ever agree to come back.
Yeah, we'll do it again.
If you would ever agree to come back, it'd be phenomenal.
Sure. Yeah. Lovely to talk to you. I like your Eagles t-shirt.
Thank you so much for saying that. They're one of my favorite bands.
Oh my God. Okay. Totally makes sense. Totally makes sense. You
Yeah.
and your Eagles. Enjoy your fun panel who comes next. Scott Reid and
Thank you.
It'll be a gas.
Scott Reid does not like the Eagles as much as I. We may get into it. I wouldn't be surprised.
Who does he like? April Wine or something?
I'm going to bring that up with him. All right.
Bye.
On that note, thank you, Jennifer Welsh, very, very much.
See ya.
So, winter is coming. In Canada, that means cold that can make you gasp. Houses and cars entombed in ice. Maybe that dead click when you turn the ignition key. And if you think a car is hard to manage in deep winter, try firing up 500,000 pounds of CN locomotive, then pulling a loaded train across 3,000 kilometers at 30 below zero. In severe cold, rails become less flexible, and ice crystals wear down wheels. I did not know that. Rails break, frozen gaskets leak, and air brake systems are severely stressed. And yet, Canadians expect CN's trains to keep rolling, which they do. In fact, the pandemic spiked demand for food and grain, and CN has every reason to believe that will continue this winter. So, CN has a plan. Its formal title, unsurprisingly, is the Winter Plan. The railway has spent billions on locomotives specially prepped for winter and air distribution cars that ensure smooth air flow through long brake lines. It has track inspection cars that automatically monitor the integrity of steel rails as the train rolls over them. CN even does avalanche monitoring. CN is a foundational Canadian company, and Canada is winter. Oh, a little safety reminder here. If you're at a train crossing, thinking about dashing across, don't. Trains always appear to be traveling a lot slower than they are. They can't stop quickly, and a train hitting a car is like a car hitting a pop can. Be patient, stay safe, don't be the pop can. Okay, Jenny, Scott, we're back for another week. Can you believe we made it? 2020, every week we make it is a gift.
Sorry, who's this?
We're back this week.
Who's that talking? Herle, I didn't think it could be you because you're wearing an Eagles shirt, and I've always thought of you as someone who had refined musical taste, and the Eagles blow. So that doesn't really square. Obviously, someone has taken possession of your body and unique hairstyle.
You don't know anything about music. You are such a snob, just, based on fashion. It is, rock snobs hate the Eagles. Everybody who likes music loves the Eagles. And I dare you take the Eagles' greatest hits and Hotel California back to back. You don't like an artist who has better music than that.
Scott, you even like the Kiss song, Beth or whatever. You've talked about it several times on the podcast, and that's terrible.
I love Beth, and it's not terrible. It's great, and it's got some life and some energy in it, which is the opposite of somebody's going to hurt somebody, or even worse, God help us, Tequila Sunrise. I bet they were laying on the floor when they recorded the song. There's no effort to even raise their voices. It's not music. It's just like old men talking. Fuck.
All right, I'm going to be controversial here. Name an artist other than Dylan that you like.
John Prine, The Clash. I'm wearing The Clash. I love The Clash. Anybody. I have acres. I made my son yesterday when we drove up to the cottage. I made him listen to Red Sovine. Now that right there is a recording artist, Red Sovine. Come on, truckers. Come on back and talk to Teddy Bear.
Yeah.
Now we're talking good shit there. Way better than the Eagles.
John Prine does not have a song as good as One of These Nights.
Are you kidding me?
No.
That is an insane thing to say. That's Lake Marie. God, I worship at its altar. Eagles would...
Good for you.
No. Everybody. Trump killed John Prine, and the whole world is angry.
Jenny, John Prine or One of These Nights by the Eagles?
I'll go with the Eagles. I'm with you, Danny.
No kidding. All right.
The Coen brothers, they got it right on the Eagles. The dude. Not the fucking Eagles, man. Come on, not the fucking Eagles. I'm with the dude.
And I love The Big Lebowski, but that's the only thing about it I don't agree with. Otherwise, the dude does abide.
The Big Lebowski is Stephen Harper's favorite movie of all time.
I am pleased, exceptionally pleased to know that. That is an awesome little factoid. Good for him.
Like me, after he watched it, did he put on 20 pounds in White Russians? Because I switched to drinking White Russians, and that is a deadly fucking drink, I'm telling you.
No, I don't think
cardigans.
So let's whirl around the world of politics today, folks. I would ask you how you are, but it's evident that you're fine, despite being in COVID Central there in downtown Toronto. So there's a couple of elections going on out in Canada. In Canada right now, one is in Saskatchewan. We'll get to that next week probably. But there is one that's in the heat of the battle in British Columbia. And there was a big event this week that seems to have completely derailed the Liberal campaign. I'm not out there, but from a distance, it looks, and I guess it's one of these things again where there's the crime and then there's how you handle it. So the story, as I understand it, is there's a bunch of Liberal MLAs and candidates on a virtual Zoom roast of one of their colleagues.
So many wrong things right up to this point.
Unless you're Lucille Ball and you're sitting next to Foster Brooks and Nipsey Russell, roast should not be in your lexicon. Big mistake. Flashing fucking red light. I don't understand what they could have been.
And I also
during the red.
Unbelievable. Hey guys, let's just play with this gun. There's one bullet in it. Who wants to hold it first?
And let's put the leader there. And I think we're being too generous to the BC Liberals to say it's completely derailed their campaign. I'm not really sure it was ever on the rails.
No, that's right. It wasn't. No, that's right. It was going badly, and now it's gotten worse. So on this Zoom call, a female member of the legislature is talking about how the roastee, a male member of the legislature, is unable to resist the charms of this NDP female MLA, who is apparently young and very attractive, in addition to being a professional engineer and an accomplished person. Academically and professionally. And the joke is that this guy's a tough talker about the NDP, but when it comes to this particular MLA, he cannot stop from slubbering and drooling when he looks at her, and therefore he's weak. So this is the joke. This gets told. Everybody laughs and chuckles along with this story, and then it leaks. And
did it leak, or did they do it in a semi-public?
No, they did.
It leaked.
They did it in. They did it in Zoom.
Because I've seen the Zoom footage, so like it's. But you're saying that was a leak. They didn't.
Some alternative media outlet released the entire Zoom call. So obviously they had a Bevel Aqua type leak in there, right?
There's an implied allegation of 20 years past in there, but.
Somebody gave Jane Tabor the call-in number. I'm just assuming.
That's for historians. But he ought to be the finance minister.
In any event, the Liberal leader still has not commented on this. And there's a debate coming up, I believe, tomorrow. So this thing is just running, and he refuses to comment, and the NDP MLA is not accepting the apology from the female roaster, and the thing just goes on and on. So why in the world would they leave the leader go days without saying what he's ultimately going to have to say?
Jenni should take this first, and I don't say that because she's so attractive. It's because she's smart. What could these people have been thinking? Fuck.
Yeah, I have. It's one of these things that there's so many things to say. Who does a roast in the era of Zoom? As someone that has participated in roasts, they're funny.
Please tell us more about that.
For another pod. So we can, they're partly because you're there. It's camaraderie. it's, what is it? Charterhouse rules, or what is it?
Chatham House rules, I think.
Chatham House rules. You in no way, it's like these Zooms are now like conference calls being leaked. Like whenever we have done conference calls, they're not, in the past, even in government, you have to assume that someone is listening that shouldn't be. So there's so many questions. One, I don't know why they would do this event in the first place. Two, I'm not sure why Wilkinson would take part of this event. Three, I'm not sure why you wouldn't try to get on top of the story the day that it broke and have the leader comment, because the leader is eventually going to have to comment. And I think it's Bowen Ma is the MLA that in question. She's an engineer and an MLA, and obviously Ralph Ralton, I think his name is, thinks she's obviously very attractive, and that was the source of the the source of the Zoom call or the roast or what have you. And of course, she's not accepting the apology because it keeps the story going. So it's all these things are very, very predictable.
I mean, honestly, what can you say? It's so absurd. Look, God knows I've authored many, many fuck ups, and they all stem from being quick with my mouth and slow with my brain. But this is really inexplicable. Like how that many people could say, let's have a roast, like, and think that it's going to come out well, and think that it's going to be contained during the writ period. The leader sits there mutely as this joke is told, doesn't say to himself, Jesus, spidey senses, you seem to be tingling loudly in the back of my neck. Nothing, zero. And, but the point really is the one you raised, David, which is, having had this happen, and it's been running for like what, 4 or 5 days now. And, days are, little gold coins during a campaign. And then if you don't cash them, then your opponent does. And so they've wasted 4 or 5 days. 4 or 5 gold coins have been dedicated to this issue, instead of him cleaning it up after one day and saying it was outrageous, it was inappropriate, I'm ashamed of the fact that I didn't intervene and say something at the time. Boom. And he would have taken another day of getting beat up for, well, if he really meant it, why didn't you do this and all that sort of stuff. And then it would have become something that would have gotten raised, but would have receded from the foreground. It's still in the foreground. And as you say, it is now almost certainly set to be the moment of the debate where he's going to have to grovel and say no, or he'll try something even more stupid and go, look, he'll do the old, like, pretend that they've already addressed an issue. We've already apologized for that, and this is no excuse for you to try to obscure your record on...
I'm not going to take any lessons from you.
Exactly. Don't you moralize to me. And it's all going to suck. It just sucks. It's plain stupidity. And I just don't, I don't know how you could possibly rationalize burning this many days on this issue. But I guess if you think a Zoom roast is a good idea, it only makes sense that you would follow it up with this level of competent management of the issue. Because like I say, Soupy Sales and Foster Brooks, yes, right? All over the roast. But none of these people are Don Rickles, and it sure shows.
You've got to be, Jenni, so tight in the writ period, because these things, and I'm not going to minimize this, although I'm old enough to know when that joke would have been uncontroversial. But I am going to say that if it had happened months and months ago or a year ago, it's unlikely it would be an issue in and of itself in this election campaign. But it did happen in the writ period. So it takes over the election campaign. It's likely now that more people in BC know about this issue than know about their promise to eliminate the PST.
And that's Wilkinson's problem, right? Is nobody is paying attention, like to Scott's point of every day of an election campaign is like a gold coin. It's mostly and it depends on how you look at it. We've all been part of election campaigns, but we're willing it to end. Like it couldn't end soon enough. And we've all been part of campaigns where we just need another week. Just give us 5 more days, give us 7 more days. And Wilkinson is in the latter category now, or at least was. And now this has kind of turned the momentum. They were heading into this election with a minority government who is now polling over 50%, depending on where you see it. So there is nothing more soul destroying or miserable than this for anyone working on that. And Wilkinson, his campaign team, his candidates, and it's just getting worse every day. It's one of those that every day you wake up, you just want it to end. Like you've gone from now wanting more time to just wanting the campaign to end because it's seemingly only getting worse.
Yeah, I know that. I've been there. I know that. But the thing is for them is that this is turning out to be a tremendous victory for cynicism in politics, isn't it? Because Horgan broke his deal with the Greens, even though they didn't want to break it, and called an election in the middle of the pandemic. And there's been no backlash to either one of those things. His numbers continue to hold, if not grow, and he's going to win the kind of majority that the NDP never win in British Columbia.
Well, and they got to worry about what the structural impact is electorally, right? I mean, never say never. These things can change on a dime, but he gets his majority locked in, so he gives himself 4 years, and the effect of this campaign, probably, unless something radically shifts in the next couple of weeks, is that he will have structurally weakened the Liberal Party offering. And so they're going to have to think about new leadership. They're going to have to think about what they're all about. How do they get back with key demographics? So it's going to really set them back. I'm not as prepared to just equate it with pure cynicism. I mean, obviously the guy was being opportunistic, and part of knowing when to be opportunistic is an important aspect of politics. I do think that Weaver leaving gave Horgan a little bit of license to say the deal is off. The deal as it was constructed with whom it was constructed no longer holds. When we look at the kinds of sins we see being committed in politics these days, I think it's pretty marginal.
Right.
Yeah, I agree with Scott.
So,
do you like the new roasts? Do you like the new comedy roast, the Comedy Central roast, like, a roast of Charlie Sheen kind of thing? Or do you like the old, like, Dean Martin roast? Like, which do you go for? Because the new ones are very funny, but extremely crude. Whereas the old ones weren't crude. They were just kind of
or funny,
lazy.
Or funny. I don't know what was wrong with me as a child because I was addicted to the Dean Martin roasts. My brother William would have me over to his house. Every time there was a Dean Martin roast on it, we would watch those things together and laugh our asses off at it. And I, with great enthusiasm, ordered those tapes off of a late night TV ad one time. They came and I excitedly put in the tapes of the Dean Martin roast. There's not a laugh to be found. You can go a whole hour.
Not true. That is not true. If I challenge you, I think I've sent it to you before. If you watch the Foster Brooks roast of Don Rickles, where he starts by turning to Dean Martin and says, "I want to thank the Puerto Rican gentleman for that kind introduction." I'm telling you, you got to get into the mindset of 1974. But Murphy, those are funny.
This is when our age differences really show on the pod.
Need to explain to you who Dean Martin is, much less.
Oh, I know who Dean Martin is. I know who Dean Martin is, but
Evel Knievel would sit at some of those. Now beat that. No topping Evel Knievel.
There can never be another Evel Knievel.
Nope.
Well, I think for roast, it's whoever is the focus of the roast is whether it's funny or not. So if you kind of know the person that's being roasted and you understand the jokes, it's funny. If you don't know the person and you don't understand you don't get what the jokes are, it's not funny.
We should have a roast.
Generally, I find roast funny.
Episode sometime. Of you, David. It's got to be the Herle roast.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
We'll for your 75th
that sounds like
birthday.
A deal, Scott. That sounds like a perfect idea. We'll put that on the schedule. So, in federal politics and Fed-Prov politics this week, big economic deal. Big economic deal. People out in the prairies probably choking as they watch the feds and the Ontario government get together to spend a lot of money to bring some jobs to Ontario. But both the feds and the province of Ontario put in about $250 million each to attract Ford to build electric vehicles at their Oakville plant in Ontario, to convert that plant into a plant that builds electric vehicles. It seems, obviously that the government money was a key part of the deal. And so, some people have talked about, oh my God, does Ford believe in electric cars now? And is Ford a climate change advocate now? I don't see this. Jenny, you agree with me because we were both on the CBC together talking about this. I don't see this as an environmental deal at all, or any commitment to everybody in Ontario should be driving electric cars by Ford. I see this as an economic story that they needed the jobs and they want the jobs. And so that's what it is about. I guess what's interesting about this is that Ford campaigned. The Wynne government believed in doing this. The Wynne government had a special fund set up to partner with private sector operations to bring jobs and investment to Ontario. And Doug Ford campaigned against that. And the Conservative Party for several elections had campaigned against that. What is the politics, Jenny, of the Premier switching his position on this?
Well,
does voters actually care about this?
Well, voters, I think, in Oakville, Burlington, and in the Golden Horseshoe care about it. And the world is a whole different place. Politicians, what they have campaigned on and what they have promised in the last elections have changed. COVID has kind of thrown all of that, have thrown a lot of things, have thrown a lot of things out of whack or on their heads. So I think that what Doug and the provincial government was looking at was solely a jobs announcement. We're talking about thousands of jobs in the Oakville, Burlington, Milton area, one of the fastest growing areas, places in the entire country. I think Milton was the fastest growing federal riding in the country from last election from the 2015 campaign to the 2019 campaign. So I think that that's solely what the government is looking at. But to your point, in terms of the federal government, David, I'm sure there were a lot of people that were looking at the help that is going out to Ontario and electric car plants, and seemingly the same has not gone out to the oil and gas industry in Alberta, which was problematic. That was a problem leading into COVID.
I think Ford deserves to get swatted on the way by for the obvious contradiction. He's saying we're going to rip out charging stations, and 2 years later, he's heralding as a cornerstone of his economic program going forward. So yeah, he should get busted on that. News Talk 1010, the radio station I'm on, they were beating him senseless. And, my friend Ryan Doyle is right of center. He's pretty right wing, pretty close to Doug. He was really beating him up on this point and saying, you were against corporate welfare, you were against the charging stations, now you're in favor. So he's really beating him up. So I think he's getting some of that. Do I think it has any consequence politically? Zero. And I just think it is seen as a jobs play. You're peddling hope in a time where hope is in short supply. You're peddling economic hope in a time where we're all struggling with COVID and wondering what the future is going to hold and how long we're going to be in lockdown and what the full economic consequences of it are going to be. You've got a couple governments coming together saying this is an industry of the future. We think we have some critical mass to maybe make ourselves a leader in it. Not now, but 5 years from now, 10 years from now, maybe it can be the new auto pact. It'll be a new EV auto pact. And, I think that people are game to give it a try. And, there's not, because of what we've gone through in the last 6 months, there's not the same political risk to signing checks. And so I think that it was almost a pure win for both sides. And, we'll see if the policy manifests itself. I support the policy, but I would also openly say I have no idea whether it will work. Like I don't know if this genuinely gives us a leg up in Ontario, in Canada, in terms of attracting that kind of industry in the future and giving us that basis. The last thing I would say, and he's a friend of yours, David, I think you look at this and, you have to say to yourself that, Unifor under the leadership of Jerry, like he is surely the most successful, powerful, and influential union leader we've had in Canada in the last 50 years. I think he surpasses those folks we think of as the generation prior, the Bob Waits and all that. You just look at what he did working with governments, and he does not hesitate to tell people to fuck off to their face. But he's always seen rough around the edges, but seen as a forceful advocate. He took that industry through 2009 in that area and now through this. And I think you have to look at him and say, he's going to go down in history as one of, if not the most powerful union leader in Canadian history.
He knows the business. He learned the business. So when he talks to the auto companies, he knows exactly where their pressure points are, where their opportunities are, what they're thinking about, and what the deal needs to be to get it here to Canada. He's very realistic about the economics of that. And he's instrumental, maybe more so than governments, in putting these packages together, which the governments then come to and fulfill. He's playing a phenomenal role in that business.
And he gives the Fords and the Trudeau's political license, right? Like they know that if he's on board, then their flank is covered politically, which is perfect politics for Ford. Like, to have that union support, the lunch bucket support, it gives him that Reagan Democrat kind of, architecture to his political coalition. And, I just, for all those reasons, like, guy's a big player.
But you guys, the question I have about Ford's change of policy on this is not that I disagree with it. In fact, I'm happy he did it. I remember tagging along with Kathleen Wynne when she was the premier. We went to the Magna auto plant, and Don Walker told us, you won't get another plant into Ontario. The auto companies will not put another plant into Ontario. But do everything you can to hold the ones we have, because the parts infrastructure around it and the ecosystem around the parts industry will all start to collapse if we lose another auto plant. So I understand. I think I have some appreciation for the importance of this, and I understand the need for government to compete with the other jurisdictions that are fucking throwing up money for this. So I don't. But when politicians change their minds on something like this, what would be bad politically about explaining it to us? The journey that they were on that led them to change the perspective that they once held or that they once campaigned on, instead of pretending like they didn't change their mind and just parroting the talking points that they used to attack before they adopted them. So when I watch Ford up there, I'm thinking, why don't you tell us what you learned that took you to this point? I think that would be interesting.
I think you only do that if you have to. This may be... not a particularly virtuous answer, but I think that politicians will do that if it's such an obvious contradiction that there's political jeopardy in not squaring the circle. But very often you don't really need to square the circle. In a low information, low intensity world in which we live, very often that you don't need to square that circle. And the crass political assessment at the moment might be that if you dedicate more moments, more words, and more energy to describing the place that you were compared to the place that you are, that you'll just be diluting your message in the moment. And so better to just wait, take that as a cue, have an answer that pivots off of it quick. And it's all about the percentage of voice you lend to one thing or the other. So if you can't get there from here, if you must explain what led to that conversion, then politicians will. But in today's world, most of the time you don't have to. And most of the time they don't.
Well, but this is what we've talked about in terms of the last 6-7 months with COVID. It's John Horgan is benefiting as well during this election campaign. Is people are so transfixed and so actually high information on COVID that they're not judging governments on the metrics that they would normally judge governments on. And so this isn't all this stuff is not, for the most part, real. And so it's the benefit that Doug can have by campaigning against corporate welfare and then participating in it last week and not get questioned on it, because everyone is looking at most things right now in a COVID lens. I don't think it'll stay that way. I think what we talked about before in terms of BC, Horgan went when it was best for Horgan. He did not want, and why we have talked on the pod before as to why I don't understand why Trudeau and the Liberals did not try to go this spring or this fall, because I don't think it's getting better for them, but they didn't. And there's a reason why politicians are doing that. So I think that there is this added element to what Scott was saying in terms of politicians not having to explain.
But this is also our fault,
a little
David.
bit of it.
Don't you think?
Why?
This is the fault? Well, it's the fault of people who are part of the professional advice-giving universe, right? So you would have a look at the numbers. From your particular discipline, you would look at the numbers and you would say, well, the numbers suggest that awareness of the previous position is so low that it doesn't merit preemptive mention. I would say from a communications and media management standpoint, dedicate energy to that only if you must, because otherwise you're competing with your own message. And, if instead of the message being 80% about EV, it's 50-50 about where you were and where you are, then that doesn't make sense. And Jenni would say, look, on the ground, no one cares, right? What they care about is the fact that it's Oakville. This makes sense there. This is what it means in terms of the region. And so the accumulation of input that you would get from advisors would be that the cost-benefit analysis of explaining this makes no sense. So, it might be that a politician in another era might have said, look, I just think it makes sense for me to square up on this. But now you have this panel behind closed doors telling you that for a whole variety of reasons, it's not the rational choice. And we're not wrong, but it just means that we contribute to a world where those explanations and those descriptions don't occur.
I might give different advice now, though, because we've been saying this for a number of years. It's almost trite to say, but I believe it now more than ever, which is that authenticity is the most valuable thing a politician can have. And that people are so cynical about politics and so cynical about the system, Jenni, that it takes somebody who really seems like they know themselves and they can be trusted and believed because they know themselves to break through that. Doug had that in 2018. I think that every time you say something publicly that looks false or doesn't ring true to yourself, that you're a weaker candidate than you were before that. And
but I would say people, for the most part,
matters a lot now.
But no, for the most part, the people that are upset with this announcement are Liberals, like people like you guys who campaigned for win in the last election, and Conservatives, for the most part, like me. I'm actually not that upset about the announcement because I think that people have looked at Doug, and this is actually it's not inauthentic. The announcement that he made, he changed his mind, which is what I hear from you Liberals all the time as to how wonderful they think Doug is as well. He's willing to change his mind. He might have not supported corporate welfare before, but now he for the good of Ontarians in Oakville and to keep Ford as a presence for the exact reasons that you just said, he is willing to go against what he campaigned on. Like he's one would argue that he's being completely authentic.
Well, let me add one more thing to that, David, because and maybe we're digging too deep down this hole, but with Ford, I don't disagree with your point at all, David, but it goes back to what I was saying about that initial assessment as to how much awareness there is so that you can assess the political risk of not describing the journey. And so if it gets to the point where it's going to be a mark against your authenticity, then you must explain it. But I guess I sort of shake my head at the example of Ford these days, though, because I find that when you say, well, nothing matters more than authenticity, I find that all that Ford has to do in order to get people applauding for his authenticity is to stand at the microphone, which he does almost every goddamn day, and says, Jesus Christ, folks, like if we just, we got to get these fucking cases down. We got to get to work on it. Like, I can't believe these people getting together, these parties here. And, it's just, what do you got, rocks in your head? And people go, I said rocks in his head. He's such a regular Joe. And it's like, I'm sitting there going, well, how can you be expressing outrage about the failure of the system when you're the one that's managing the motherfucking system? And so I guess I agree with your point about authenticity, but I'm I'm a little bit alarmed at what it takes to meet the authenticity test these days. Because it seems like Ford tells us day after day after day, all you have to do is sort of wander up to the mic and screw out a little country lawyer charm, and that does the trick. You know, folks, like we gotta quit messing around. Come big or go home.
But Scott, you love that. When I was critical of all levels of government in the spring, you were on the exact opposite. You were saying that was wonderful. You were calling Doug.
Because
you thought it was wonderful.
I thought it was connecting. I still do.
When I was critical,
I can't help it. I hate it, but he's connecting. But
you loved it. No. But you loved it in the spring. If you
go back, loved Doug Ford. Don't say that. You guys made a joke out of that. I've never loved Doug Ford. I wouldn't put my arms around his big belly. I wouldn't kiss his big face. I wouldn't. I don't love Doug Ford. Okay. But what I'm saying is...
You had a little crush on him in the spring. You had a little crush on him.
If you go back and listen, you disagreed when I was...
I'm not going to go back and listen, so knock it off! You just talking about that. I don't love Doug Ford. Quit saying I do. Stamp it double time. Fuck you people. Screw me all up.
Oh, God. All right. So back to politics now for a second.
All right.
The Conservatives in Ottawa want a corruption committee to be established to continue the investigations into the WE contract. So I guess the question is, why is this new procedure required? What is a corruption committee? And who still cares about this issue? Jenny, do you want to go?
Obviously, I think the people that care about it the most are the Liberals, because they're trying to find whatever way they can to shut down any conversation on it. So if they really weren't worried about it, they would have let the Finance Committee or they would have let the Ethics Committee actually investigate into this. So I'm not sure the Conservatives fully believe they need a corruption committee, but they feel it's probably the only way that they're going to be able to get any answers, because obviously there is a lot more here, as predicted, that the Liberals do not want to see the light of day. Otherwise, they wouldn't be fighting this hard. And God knows what deal they have made with Jagmeet Singh, who, by the way, has just made himself the most irrelevant NDP leader of ever, which it says something, but he is completely irrelevant, completely deemed that party irrelevant. They lost half their seats in the next election, leading into whenever the next election is, they'll be down to like Alex McDonough territory.
Well, not surprised.
Jenny, even if you have to speculate, what would be a finding that would come out now? Conceivably, what would be a finding that would matter?
Well, I think where the Liberals are most right now, where they're worried, seems to be the financial gain that anyone within the Prime Minister's family got from WE, as well as any other government officials or family members of government officials. It seems to be there's still a lot of questions about that. There's still obviously a lot of questions generally about the WE charity to begin with. Of course, it doesn't exist. The Me to WE corporate arm still exists, and I think that every day that people are investigating the Kielburgers and what seems to be the complete shadiness of this charity, that is another day that it's in the news for Justin Trudeau.
Okay, I'm in a completely different place. And, I've known Mark and Craig for a long time. So you're going to have to discount maybe everything I say. I've known them well. I've worked with them. I went to Africa with them, saw what they did. I've donated thousands of dollars to WE, and I helped build one school in Kenya, personally donated, and I don't regret it a bit. And I first of all, I loathe the idea in the phrasing corruption, a corruption committee. I think it's really dangerous to throw the word corruption around when there is no evidence of corruption. Corruption means people are on the take. It means government officials and elected government representatives or their staff are making money personally. And I think that's a very severe thing to just get lazy about using, and I don't like it. Second, this thing has been investigated, for Christ's sake. And you know what? Here's what those guys did wrong, as far as I can tell. And yeah, they're people I know. But as far as I can tell, their mistake was that they, I think naively, to be fair, thought that accepting a sole source contract in a world of $500 million, $540 million, that a sole source contract of that, that would not land them in the crosshairs of politics. And they live in a world where they're on with Oprah. And I think 99% of what propels this stuff is that people don't like them. They don't like their manner. They think they're virtue signalers. They don't believe that they're the real thing. I've seen them up close. I believe they are the real thing. You don't have to agree with me, but I believe they are the real thing. And I think they've done a lot of good.
No, people see them as weirdos. Yes.
And people, maybe they do. I don't dispute that. I don't dispute that. But that doesn't mean that their 25 years of work should be fucking shred to cheese, which is what's happened.
Oh my God.
It has been.
They're 25 years of work.
They've investigated this thing to the
They're
end
multimillionaires.
lines.
No, okay. And then there is no one within the federal Liberal government that actually saw all of the red flags leading into this.
That's all fair, but that's all been examined and litigated in great length.
No, it hasn't.
You've heard from the clerk of the Privy Council. You've heard from the bureaucrats who ran the file. You heard from the Prime Minister and the Prime Minister's chief of staff. And everyone tells the same story, which is that they said, we got to design this stupid service program. And the bureaucrats said, I don't know who can do it. These guys have a national infrastructure. And there aren't unanswered questions other than whether there was an actual breach of ethics, and the ethics commissioner will rule on that. Presumably, he'll rule against the Prime Minister. Like, what the Christ is there to examine? And what more do you want from it? Like, it's like you just said, they should be looking into the Kilburgers more.
So Bardish Chagger, she didn't lie when she testified at committee, and then the documents that came out that actually showed that she lied. I don't think there's
any evidence that she lied. And I'll
send you the story.
Okay. Well, the suggestion that, and again, maybe I'm compromised because I've known them a long time.
Yeah,
but I've watched this thing. I saw all these officials, political level and lifelong bureaucrats testify. And I'll be goddamned if I can identify something that occurred other than the fact that they sole sourced this contract.
And Scott, why will not the Liberals
because who wants to perpetuate this stuff when they've done all these answers? You know why? Like Katie Telford, when she testified.
That's not democracy. Oh, don't even get me
when Katie testified, there's all these questions. They're going, I want to know about this official, this political advisor, and she said, look, you got questions for them, ask me. I'm here as a representative of the Prime Minister's office and the unelected public servants, the unelected public advisors, public office holders that work in his office. You got questions for them, ask me. But it's like, what? We're going to call now, instead of having 6 people that have testified, you're going to call 13 more?
Yes,
you're going to call the 23-year-old?
That is what
you have to meet a preponderance. Well, no, you don't.
Okay.
Well, but the New Democrats don't agree with you. So that's democracy, actually.
Okay.
So, Jenni, are the Conservatives fishing, or do they have a hypothesis?
Well, I think everyone has. I don't work for the Conservatives, so I don't know what they're. I don't know what.
Yeah, I'm sorry, but you understand the position better than I do.
I'm
looking for something in particular.
Well, I think they're looking for answers, and I think that this is one thing that this government has refused to give answers on any of this. They prorogued Parliament to stop any investigation into the committee hearings on we, and then when Parliament came back, because there was really no reason to prorogue except for that. That's the only thing that was shut down. It's not like Parliament was meeting at that point. If you remember, the NDP made a deal with Trudeau back in the spring, so it's not like they were meeting. Literally, the sole reason why they stopped meeting was to stop talking about the investigation into we. And as soon as Parliament comes back, they've now said we don't want to talk about we. So one would say where there is a bit of smoke, there's fire. So I don't know what the Conservative committee members have. They obviously feel that there is more questions that need to be answered, as do many Canadians like me.
Isn't the fundamental question? I think there's a legit question there. And the legit question was, was the contract directed? Obviously, we know it's a huge contract. We know it's sole source. We know there was a lot of looseness and laziness in terms of the idea and the design of the program. Like, it was kind of like, we want a service program. We don't know. Bureaucrats go figure it out and find a mechanism to execute it. But I think the legit question at the middle of it was it directed from the political level? And that that question's been asked to a pile of people, and the answer keeps coming back. No, it doesn't appear to be. And so, but I don't know. Then the other question is, was there a breach of ethics? And we know it cost Cosmo's job, more or less.
It's basically, it's all mealy mouth in terms of answers, like Bardish Chagar, misleading committee and saying that she didn't have a conversation with the Kielburgers 3 days before she actually had a conversation on the delivery mechanism of the actual program.
But they all talked about that. They talked about the fact that they had been writing the government looking for a government program that wasn't this one, and then they were like, okay.
It came out in the information that was released by committee. The few papers that were actually not redacted.
Well, let me just add this thing as a final note from me anyway. I think at some point, the Conservatives run a risk if they appear to... I think that the Conservatives netted a lot of fish on this thing. Like, politically, I think that they made a lot of gain. And, Morneau is no longer there. They had, whatever it was, 3 or 4 hours of the Prime Minister, 3 or 4 hours of the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff. These are unusual, atypical events. I think they they cashed in big time. There was a
corresponding decline in the Liberal polling numbers.
Yeah. So, for sure, right? So I think... at some point on these things, you have to.
So you're saying the risk.
All I would say. Let me finish what I was saying. All I would say is, at some point, you have to decide when you're declaring victory on it. And I think, if I were them, there's a risk if you just keep harping on it. People go, I think your priorities are misplaced. Like you're spiking the football not once but 6 times in the end zone. It's like,
those were the exact talking points the Liberals. That's the exact talking points the Liberals were using 3 months ago when this started.
Well, I don't know about their talking points. I'm just telling you what I think. I think there's political jeopardy for the Conservatives if they keep making it sound like this is their number one preoccupation.
And I'm sure they'll.
Weird to people.
And I fundamentally disagree with you, but I'm sure they'll take your advice.
It's not advice; it's a view.
But sorry, Jenni, let's just examine it for a sec. Why do you disagree? Because it is something that occurred to me too. The thing is that the media are so interested in this story, or at least have been so interested in this story, that it's really difficult to be moving aggressively on this issue and get new space for other things that you're talking about. And we have been talking on this show about how the politics of COVID is changing, and governments are getting more and more vulnerable on COVID-related policies. So I guess the reason I asked you whether there was a hypothesis was, if you think there's something there that will be explosive, then I understand why you keep digging.
Well, because I think
if you're just fishing, I wonder if Scott's point isn't right. Not that you'll pay a price for doing it, but that it's a missed opportunity to be laying some track on something else.
But I'm saying, I actually don't think it is fishing. I think the fact of how the Liberals have actually responded to this shows that there is actually more there that they do not want revealed to the public, which is what I said back when we did our first pod on this back in June. There is something that does not smell right here, and the Liberal Party would not care. This is a government that actually is fine usually with having this kind of stuff dragged out into the open. Like they've weathered 3 different investigations. The Prime Minister himself, they've been fine with it. There is something with this that they obviously do not want they do not want the public, and they do not want Parliament to find out about, because they are trying way too hard to keep it buried, which is why, if I was the Conservatives, I would be fighting to get any documentation and more interviews with people that were part of this decision making.
Scott, do you think this shutting down of things, though? I mean, I'm not following it very closely, but I did see the Easter clip that was being circulated of the committee. Do you think that kind of tactics on the part of the government helps or hinders this?
It doesn't help, but at some point, I think there's a more obvious explanation. And the obvious explanation is this issue cost the government severely. And I think it was sloppiness, not something more nefarious. So they designed this program. We're in the COVID world. They're jamming these programs out. We're talking big dollars, and it goes out. There's all this sloppiness around it. And so then they are subjected to weeks and weeks of hearings, front page news over and over again. As you said, David, their polling took a hit, and it cost them a finance minister. And I just think that it was, they endured weeks and weeks of it. And they're like, okay, well, you've got all this that was that has occurred. The big questions have been answered. And why would you permit there to be a new round of more hearings and more people being forced to hire lawyers and testify and go through all this stuff? And in aid of what at this point? So I wouldn't want that to be driving my daily news agenda if I was in the government either. I don't think they're in a world where they're saying, God, we got to shut this down because they're going to find out, the caramel secret at the middle of all this. I think they're shutting it down because they're like, we took a shit kicking on this thing, and we're not going to start back up just to go over the same ground when all the big questions have actually been answered.
Yeah, but I don't think you think all the big questions have been answered?
Yeah, I do. I think
I'm going to give you the last word, Jenni.
I've already said this is the Liberal Party is going to try to bury and I hope the Conservatives and I hope the NDP grow a set and start working with the Conservatives here to uncover what exactly were the mechanisms behind this program, because there is absolutely more to this, as I said. Otherwise, the Liberals wouldn't be fighting so much to make sure that it never sees the light of day.
All right. Okay. Because we are political pundits, we are contractually, legally obligated to talk about Trump, whether we want to or not. So here we go. I'm going to start off by saying we talked, I don't know whether it was last week or the week before, I was running on about how some of the swing states were still competitive, and you could see, if you were 4 or 5 points back, you wouldn't be giving up, how you could still have a path. All the swing state polls are getting worse for Trump. Everything is sliding in the wrong way. He has no message that is of any relevance to anybody anymore. He appears to have lost that connection that he had with people. I think he's done, unless Biden loses this thing with some extreme thing. I don't even think there's an act of God that could really, an October surprise of any kind that could turn this for Trump. I think it's all Biden. I'm not even going to watch Trump anymore for the rest of the election. I'm only going to watch Biden, and I'm going to watch him every moment of the day, because I'm just going to will him to stand upright and continue to speak in something resembling complete sentences, because that's all he needs to do. But I'm not sure that he's up for that for the next 2 weeks, so I'm scared. But nonetheless, that's where things are at. Trump is fucking done, and good riddance.
Well, because everybody likes the guy who says, this is exactly what I predicted. I'm going to give people the opportunity to love me even more, because I really did feel the moment that he got that COVID diagnosis, that it was over. And I did say at the time, look, we're going to start to see this thing get ugly and really move away from him in the swing states. We're going to watch the Senate start to fall apart, and we're going to start to watch Senate candidates for the Republicans start to move away from him. And you've really started to see that in the last handful of days. And I enjoy it. I'm different than you though, David. I will absolutely be glued to the television for the next 3 weeks. 3 weeks today, he gets canned. I'm going to be glued to the television to watch every moment of him, because like the New York Times piece that ran a week or so ago,
I'm sick of him. I'm sick to death of him.
I'm perversely and pathetically and ashamed to confess that I'm going to miss him. I'm going to miss the levels of rage and loathing he inspires within me. I'm going to miss the spectacle of his corruption. In his case, it is merited, and his perversity. And so I'll be watching, because I'll also enjoy the incoherence of his last sort of wearing Depends to an event as he just absolutely wets himself all over the stage. I think it's a glorious thing to watch this guy circle the toilet bowl. So it's grand fun.
You're going to be out of grand, Jenni. You're going to be out of grand.
Possibly.
We have to identify where that money will go. I will not put it in my own pocket. That would not be that would not be cricket. We have to find a good cause for that $1,000 to be placed.
Yeah, it's so weird to watch. And I'll be honest, I have watched less in the last kind of couple of weeks. The COVID thing was bizarre. I think we all watched not last Friday, but the Friday before. We talked about that, the difference between CNN and Fox. The whole thing is just so strange to watch overall. Like we're talking about the president who went out and did this giant rally yesterday with COVID or without COVID. Who knows? Like in this pandemic time, regardless of kind of where you stand on the issue. And we're talking about the only thing that the guy that could beat him needs to do is basically survive. Like, David, you're like basically saying, I just hope Biden keeps standing and breathing.
Yeah. Unless Biden disqualifies himself from the job, he'll get it.
I think that Trump is doing so badly right now that Hillary could win. I think she might just be declared the winner on election night. They'll be like, sorry, Joe, right? We have had to go back in time and give it to Hillary.
I'd rather her than Biden, I will tell you that.
So it'll be interesting. It'll be an interesting one to watch, but it's a weird, the whole thing is just very strange to watch overall.
I assume like all the people like us for him, I mean, and some of them are obviously just criminals and awful people, but like there's no campaign apparatus. There's no nothing going on now, right? They just execute his crazy whim, right? It's like, hey, I want to go to Florida. I want to go to Ohio. I want to go get ice cream. Let's go. And they just go, yes, sir. Yes,
but
sir.
They have, I saw on social media, Ivanka was in like Wisconsin. She ended the day in Wisconsin and said she was doing a 3 states in 1 day tour. So I assume kind of.
I bet she plays in Wisconsin, eh? She's got that real.
I'm just saying she
dirt beneath her manicure kind of vibe.
I don't know what's going on with their. I don't know what's going on with their cash situation, but they appear to be out of cash as well because they're pulling out of TV in states they desperately need to win. So the whole thing appears to be crumbling, literally.
It's so good, eh? So good. It's like a slice of apple pie. It's just delicious.
Anybody watch the VP debate?
Yep. I had to watch it.
Clips.
I had to watch it for TV.
You watched it, Jenny?
I watched clips afterwards.
Right. A non-event like we predicted, I think.
Yeah. I don't think it changed anything. She was highly scripted. I think the whole, I'm speaking, that was scripted. She planned to do that at some point during the debate. I don't think Pence was mansplaining her at all. I think she was in part of a debate. So that would be the only thing that I would say about that.
Could you remain that still with a fly on your head?
Nope.
He didn't seem to know he had the fly on his head, did he?
I know. It's weird, eh?
Yeah. Because he's a lord of hell. That's why. He doesn't even notice it. It's his natural resting position.
Would it not have made a buzzing sound?
He's Beelzebub. He's just like, yes, here I am. My feast of flies, my kingdom of shit. That's just a natural thing. But one thing I was surprised in listening to some of the podcasts I like from the states that cover politics that are not all like hardcore Democrats and all that stuff. I was a bit surprised. I saw the debate differently. It didn't matter. So that was always my view. But I saw it differently in that I thought that I didn't think she did as well as many people seem to review. Like she got her runs out in certain places for clip purposes, but she struck me as nervous. I think she struck me as someone who was like going, God, here I am. I'm a black woman. I got to go up against this guy. I can't be too angry. I can't be too forceful, but I can't get pushed over. I mean, by the time you do all of those calculations in your mind as a candidate, you're left with such a narrow piece of real estate to walk, And I just think, it's just
and I don't have to do anything to win it.
No,
I don't have to do anything to win it, but I could lose it. And as a black woman, where is the threshold at which she's too angry? So low. So low.
Even her saying, "Excuse me, Mr. Vice President, I'm talking." Some people thought, like, getting out of control. So, I just think in terms of futures, it's going to be really interesting to watch and see how, forget the electorate, how the Democratic Party responds to her.
Well, but when she said "Excuse me, Mr. Vice President," that was because she didn't want to answer the question that Pence was posing to her, and that was about the Trump tax cuts. That was, she didn't want to get clipped on. She didn't want to get clipped saying something that would hurt them in like Florida or Utah or what have you. That was that moment. That took away from the fact that she didn't answer that question.
Well, maybe, but he got, he just mansplained and interrupted her, ran over the whole. As someone that's actually
been mansplained, that was not mansplaining. That was a debate. Okay. Come on.
I thought he was pretty objectionable, nonstop, just blah, blah, blah.
No.
But
he's hard to pin down, though, because the way he talks. But anyway, you know what? We're out of time. We're out of time, folks. The time has flown by. And so I want to thank you both for being here with me today and being in such good cheer. And I want to thank our listeners for tuning in again this week. And, of course, thank the Air Quotes Media team that is behind this, particularly Jill Engelman and Metal Donkers Good for producing this episode. And we are going to be answering a mailbag question. So if you want to go to airquotesmedia.com, you can check out the mailbag question, which is about caucus and caucus secrecy, I think. So anyway, check us out on the website. Check us out next week in the pod. And in the meantime, take care of yourselves and be well.